Well, so in the 50s, Merton is pretty quiet. He's recovered the Cistercian tradition. He's discovered the Desert Fathers. He's discovered the patristics. He's getting the theology that he never had. He's reading everything. He's reading everybody. He was a voracious reader, and he's making notes. He made methodical notes like crazy. Out of these notes came these books, his thoughts as his world opened up. But he was a very bookish person. But he knew it wasn't in books. Whatever he was getting, it wasn't in the book. The book was this way to tap into something else. Well, he's starting to become so vivacious as a monk that he's starting to appear a little crazed to his superiors and some of the brothers. And they're starting to worry that he's getting a little too excited about what he's writing about and saying. And they're actually literally thinking that he is starting to crack up in a psychological way. Almost as if maybe he's somewhat neurotic or psychotic. Now in the 50s, we're sort of just, Freud's sort of catching up with us. We're starting, if you remember those times where we start to kind of discover psychology and then we all kind of become kind of pop, amateur psychologists in the 70s, the me decade and self-help books arrived. But we're already starting to think there's something about our minds not quite right. What about our parents? We're starting to wonder about therapy and all of this. This is really live stuff in the 50s. Well, Gethsemane doesn't know anything about this. Their sense of spiritual psychology comes from this long tradition. It does not come from Freud. Merton starts to get really interested in psychology. And he wants to go meet at the time, a very famous psychologist named Zurchberg, who was in New York. Well, the abbot was thinking the same thing. You do need to go see a psychologist. I think there's something wrong with you. And they get and I got to think of his name. He's still alive, a monk in, I think he's at Genesee now. He was a good close friend of Merton's. Became an abbot. Maybe it'll pop in when I quit thinking. So the abbot told Merton, I'm going to go introduce you to this guy. We're going to go hear a speaker, a theologian or something. We're going to take a little trip, and your friend, who's going to be my sort of co-spy, is with me in on this. And what we're actually going to do is send you to this psychologist, put you on the couch, and let him see what he thinks. Well, this is in the mid-50s, mid-56, 57, and they go, and Merton is very excited because he wants to, what is this psychology? I need to know about this. And he goes, and the guy asks him questions. He tells what he's thinking, what he's experiencing. And this is the man that told Merton, you are the most egotistical person I've ever met in my life. You want to be a hermit, but you want to be on Times Square. You want to have your hermitage in the middle of the world, neon lights, everybody looking at you. You're full of yourself. Now, partly, he has fed this, the psychologist has fed this kind of awful interpretation from some of the things that the abbot is kind of worried about. But the abbot doesn't know if he can actually psychoanalyze Merton, but he's concerned about him. And Merton is even talking about cracking up. What's happening is the Spirit's busting through him. He's like a horse in a corral, and he's kicking every plank, and he's knocking over people, and he's just so excited, and they're trying to contain him. This is not monkish behavior. A horse bucking everyone. So they take him, and the psychologist assails him, just ridicules his character, mocks his whole monastic pretense, and because it wasn't the normal monkish routine. And Merton has he breaks down in tears. It's one of the most moving parts of his journals, his private journals we got a hold of later on. He didn't have his journals published until 27 years after his death. And someone was watching it, okay, it's 27 years, go. And then they just started publishing those things as quickly as they could. And people just read these things. Even brothers who were still at the Gethsemane monastery were amazed at what they were reading, what he was going on inside of him psychologically as well as spiritually. They had no idea. And his soul was in tremendous tumult. And he felt like maybe he should leave the monastery. Maybe he is cracking up, and maybe he's making this stuff up. He's experiencing something so real, and he's not getting confirmation from anyone around him, that he's thinking he's literally losing his mind. But he still doesn't really think so. And he's got to keep listening. He's got to keep paying attention. And what happens, he has a breakdown in terms of tears and confession, and he admits maybe the psychologist is right, and maybe I should get some help. I'm open to that. I mean, he was humiliated if you read it, but he took the spiritual depth of the experience and was humbled by the humiliation itself. And it's an amazing kind of time for his life, where the joke is on everybody, because then the other monk, I wish I could remember his name. It's John Hughes Bamberger. Thank you, John Hughes Bamberger, Father John Hughes. Maybe some of you, maybe you may know it. You may know him. He's a very interesting. He wrote a nice book about Evagrius, one of the desert monks. John Hughes was then sent, because it seemed important to study psychology, they sent him to Rome to go get a Ph.D. in psychology and then come back. And this is often some of the monks would be sent off to get educated on something and bring it back and teach the community. So John Hughes went and got a degree in psychology, came back, and as far as he could tell, Merton was actually okay. And the father, Dom James Fox, had a turnaround as well. You're not cracking up. You're really on to something. I'm going to kind of pay attention to what it is you're saying. It's like a light came on in a dark place almost, or a flower cracked up through asphalt. Somehow Merton brought some new life in. Young monks were coming in, young novices, students in droves. And then they started to create sister houses. It's a Holy Spirit in Conyers, Georgia, Mepkin in South Carolina. These are sister houses of Gethsemane. They just mushroomed after World War II, and particularly after Merton. And now Merton's gone, and then that kind of that movement is kind of lessening, and some of the houses are a little lower. But this was a tremendous experience, but it was a blow to Merton's psyche in the normal, rational kind of sense, to where he was so confused about the spiritual experience of God in himself as possibly being conflated with this torment of his own mind, what he was doing to himself. And he wanted to know the difference. He couldn't resolve this himself, so he kept pressing on. He kept going. Second breakthrough is the most famous one. It's called the Fourth and Walnut Experience. How many people are familiar with that? Have you heard it? You've heard about that, right? This is probably the most famous Merton story. It's 1958. He goes to Louisville. There's a part two that's kind of funny about this, but he's in town, one of the normal kind of runs to see a dentist or something, to pick up some supplies for the monastery. Merton, of course, did not drive because nobody trusted him driving, so he always rode with somebody. They're in town, and he's walking downtown in the good old days, and when you went shopping or to work, you went downtown in the city. And so he's downtown Louisville at the corner of 4th and Walnut, which is right in the center of the very, very active downtown. It's now called 4th and Muhammad Ali, because Ali is from Louisville. So at 4th and Walnut, Merton is looking at all the people, all the secretaries walking by, all the executives walking by, salespeople in their briefcases, people going to lunch, just the routine work traffic moving through a city like ants, and he's dazzled by what he sees. And he looks at all these people, and he has this incredible experience that they're all shining like the sun. And he's thinking, how can you tell them? He senses this, but he knows he can't go up to, excuse me, do you know you're shining like the sun? Could you please hold it down? He knows he can't communicate that. But how could you communicate that? How can you tell people that this resplendent glory is pulsing through them? It's coming out, it's emitted everywhere, this light, and they don't necessarily know it, and they're not privy to that. How do you tell them, this is going on in you, I sense it? Well, he didn't tell them, but he had this breakthrough in his ability to see this or sense it. And it wasn't like seeing auras. He sensed the gravity of this was that he sensed that he was a human being. He saw everybody shining like the sun, and he realized that he was human just like them. The gloriousness of God was shining through these perfectly ordinary, non-monastic, non-religious human beings just going about their business on the sidewalk, and they're just radiating the light of God. And he realized this is what he most wants to be, not radiating light, but human. He realizes he's a human being, he's like everybody. And for him, following this really tough experience with a psychologist named Zilchberg, is life transforming for Merton. He realizes he's a human being. He's more in communion with everybody now. Everything he's been studying that's been coming through him and that he's sensing, these experiences that he's writing about, this is truth itself. It's truth incarnate, and it's in everywhere, and we are connected to everybody. And it wakes him up to everything that's going on in the world is important now. Before he had shut the world off. Party boy goes, off to the monastery, not to look back. He'd turn into a pillar of salt. Well, he goes back, and then comes out in the world, and he realized, I'm in this whole world. I'm not enclosed by the monastery. My life is connected to everybody around. And this just starts to grow and grow in him. And his correspondence really beefs up with people all over the world in all kinds of cultures and other languages. And he cannot get enough of connecting with people all over the place. You read his letters, it's astounding. One, that he would have the boldness just to write somebody who was famous or just did something, but if they had any realness about them, he wanted to be in contact with that. And these two experiences really mark the 50s. The 50s is when he writes Thoughts in Solitude. Early in the 50s, before the psychologist incident, he writes these very quiet, very wise sayings. But it doesn't get published till after he's had this Fourth and Walnut experience, and the whole book has a new meaning at this point. Those two kind of watershed, normal human being kinds of experiences, I guess, were kind of landmark perspectives. Landmark experiences for his spiritual perspective in the 50s. So let's look, what has any of this got to do with silence? So let me read this on our second blue page, Conference 3, Silence. This paragraph comes a little further in the book. Solitude has to be objective and concrete. And let me stop for a second. Keep this Fourth and Walnut experience in mind. He's thinking that solitude in the earliest days was actually away from everybody. He comes to realize that solitude, spiritually deeply understood, has to do with communion with everything. Because when you go into solitude, you go into the depth of your life in silence, which is rooted in God, which is where everything else that exists, that has possibility of existing, it's all in God. So when you go into solitude to meet God alone, you actually come and find yourself in contact and communion with everyone and everything else. And it's got to be real, which is why he's saying solitude has to be objective and concrete. It has to be a communion in something greater than the world, as great as being itself, in order that in its deep peace we may find God. We put words between ourselves and things. Even God has become another conceptual reality in a no man's land of language that no longer serves as a means of communication with reality. The solitary life, being silent, clears away the smoke screen of words that man has laid down between his mind and things. In solitude, we remain face to face with the naked being of things. And yet we find that the nakedness of reality, which we have feared, is neither a matter of terror or shame. It is clothed in the friendly communion of silence, and this silence is related to love. When we have really met and known the world in silence, words do not separate us from the world, nor from other men, nor from God, nor from ourselves, because we no longer trust entirely in language to contain reality. That's a big statement for a writer to make, that reality is not contained in language. That's all you got to work with if you're a writer. Yeah. Did you?
Your paper.
Oh, do I?
And the book says unreality.
Oh yeah. It's another conceptual reality. It is a conceptual unreality. That was a slip of my own thinking and typing. It's so easy for. I'm glad you pointed out the mistake. It's really a good one to. It's a good one to celebrate for a minute. Let's just thank her for showing this, because for Merton, reality is not conceptual. So particularly God. So a concept is something that we form. And we can have concepts of reality. It's certainly fine. But what he's talking about here, another conceptual unreality, is often what we confuse with our own concepts of reality. And so he's always kind of bracing himself against his own tendency to conceptualize his experience, which turns unreality into reality. Then we think we're confronting or facing or living reality itself. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm getting out of the whole of my typing, but I would have made that mistake. That would have been a mistake, because I would have understand what that's what we do. We conceptualize reality, but it's another conceptual unreality. An unreality is almost a conceptual reality for Merton. If you put this into context with that, for the reference to Fourth and Walnut, Merton is experiencing these people. He's in solitude and he's not talking to them, but he feels like he's in communion with them, and he would like to communicate with them, but it's a question: how can you tell people they're shining like a sun? Is he conceiving this? Is that the reality? Would it be if you went up to them, they would say, "I don't see that. I don't see that." So when we have spiritual experiences and we take them to be real, it creates a real communication puzzle for us, which means you can back up into Merton's earlier thought in the 50s, where he can't tell the difference between his own mind and his own spirit, or his own mental confusion and digressions in his own spiritual progress. How do you tell the difference? The trap is we can't really tell the difference. But the breakthrough here for Merton is that he senses a reality that's larger than himself, that he could not have conceptualized. And he attributes that to what solitude gives you. And he attributes that to what silence brings you, which was why we would want to center ourselves in silence. But you know, the battle for us when we're centering in prayer is the mind just jumping and conceptualizing and making up things and distracting us. And we'll come back to that in just in a moment. Am I making more unsense? If we can do reality and unreality, they can be unsense and sense. Then there's common sense, and then there's uncommon sense, and then there's nonsense, and that's